Colin Seeger, a former lawyer and now consultant and university lecturer with UTS Sydney, specialising in ethics in business and intellectual property. Colin was a member of the ARIA Copyright Committee for several years and was a member of the Ethics Committee of the Law Society of New South Wales.
Good afternoon, Colin Seeger here. Welcome to part 3 of intellectual property and an interesting, diverse little group of subjects I'm dealing with today as well. Just a bit of housekeeping first. Don't forget, it's an interactive program. The opportunity is there for you to ring, either to make comments or to ask questions. Phone number is at the bottom of the screen there. Please don't hesitate. I know you've probably got bread and butter in your hand and a drink there having lunch, but pick up the phone anyway. Love to hear from you. All right. Today, as usual, 3 sections broadly broken up. I want to deal with 3 fairly diverse areas. They come together hopefully at the end of the session. You'll see the connectivity. I thought the first area I'd deal with would be a broad view of the kinds of intellectual capital, as it were, that you would normally expect to find within corporations, just so that you have a focal point in your own deliberations about what you want to do next. Then I want to deal with the processes itself of an audit, and it's it's too big a subject to be able to deal with in detail, obviously, but to give you an idea about the aspects that you should consider, some of the mechanics of how to go about it, and finally I wanted to just touch on the areas of valuation itself, how it's actually done, because there are many different ways of varying and various ways of valuing, and depends on the purpose to which you're putting it, to which will affect the valuation. All right. So, first area I want to deal with is the forms of intellectual capital within a corporation. Now, as you can see there, the first one, human capital, that is, I guess, the most important in my mind, because it draws us back to that critical element that everything we deal with here is about that conversion of electrical pulses in someone's brain into business. Human capital is all of the human skills, knowledge, attributes, interactivity, inquisitiveness, team building, all of those things. That's a really important aspect for any business. In fact, it's the core business. If you don't have that human capital, you don't have a business. You have a folder with a name on the front of it. So every time I talk about this process, I can't emphasize enough the need to come back to human capital as being the core of all the rest of it. Then you've got the area of structural capital. Structural capital is more the wherewithal. It's the vehicle by which the human capital is transformed from the hypothetical, the theoretical, into the practical. And structural capital is all of those things such as plant, what you've already got or which you can acquire, funds, the ability to find funds, to find the appropriate investors or funders for a particular project is a critical aspect. Oftentimes that's missing in all of these activities is a great idea and not the appropriate funding source. Information technology, in the sense of the infrastructure that you have to help manage the intellectual property that you're creating, IT systems generally, and obviously expert systems as well. Knowledge banks, and that's the accumulated information that businesses acquire. Now that can be, as I'll deal with later, in various forms, but knowledge in the broad sense of within the organisation, who knows what, and who knows what. And you've got the organisational and infrastructure skills. That is the ability of a corporation to somehow activate and galvanise individuals and groups of individuals so that it become a coherent group. A business of 40 individuals each doing their own business is not a business. That's an interesting ant farm, but it's not a business. A business is about a coordinated, cultivated approach, and someone is going to run that. It's an orchestra, if you like, and the concert master, and there's got to be a concert master who says intellectual property is important and human values and human-centred activities are the core to where we develop this. All right? Other area there in terms of capital that you must look at is this area of customer capital. Now that's the broad range of information which deals with your interrelationship with your customers and their perception of you as a business. Now that is a huge opportunity, because if you understand your existing customers properly, that gives you the opportunity to on-sell, to upsell further products, further services, to anticipate their needs, to develop a rapport with them so that they can help you direct your business to where it really should be going. All right? The ability to understand your client base and your customer base means you can also anticipate potential customers, i.e. those who are not yet your customers, but which either could be or should be. And sometimes that is a very important distinction. The people who say, they aren't a customer, why aren't they? As opposed to, well, they aren't a customer, but we know why they're not, we don't deliver what they need. Two very different processes. And again, that's part of intellectual property, is that knowledge and that awareness and that ability to process it and have an output which is capable of being disseminated to other people within the organisation. You've got brand value, simply the value of the things, the reputation that you've generated. Now, if I said the words such as Apple, Mildara, Nike, Dell, IBM, Levi Strauss, all of those things pop images into your head, or they probably do, unless you've been living in a box for the last 25 years. It's stuff which is the bread and butter of selling style. You know, there's been some marvellous articles recently about this whole area of marketing life experience, that Nike just do it. It's not just selling a pair of running shoes, it's selling the whole concept that you can take a pair of rubber and canvas objects, strap them to your feet and feel sexy. Now that's, the ability to convert that is amazingly detailed. It involves a lot of market research, it involves a lot of organisational skill, but that is what the value of a brand is, to be able to convert a $2 shoe into a $120 item on the retail rack. That's intellectual property. All right? We have a call now. David, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Colin. How are you?
Very well, thank you.
That's good. Look, I just was interested in what you were saying about measuring intellectual property.
Yeah.
The actual processes in place within the organisation to transfer knowledge, are you suggesting that if they are very clear, such as coaching mechanisms or even a database, that in itself adds value to the intellectual property?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, I had a really interesting, as an example of this, I was down in the Antarctic Division last week talking to the people down there, and they've got 50 years of scientific and psychological records, if you like, of people, our intrepid explorers, and they've just completed a huge exercise of documenting and creating a library of all of their visual, audio-visual, photographic images, all the rest of it, and a lot of their scientific information. And they're finding now that they have a market. NASA is now buying information from them about human activities because it's accessible.
Right.
The ability to get the information, I think it's a point I made last week, information without an indexing system is
useless.
Just a bunch of facts.
Right, right.
There is value in a collection.
Okay.
And that's where, and you can value it, because you can say, at that point, I can now add a value, I can give it a function of what it could earn, either in terms of what it costs to replace this information, or what I can use in terms of licensing it out to other third parties and generate an income stream.
All right. Well, thanks very much for that.
That's all right.
Thank you. Bye.
Good to hear from you. All right. Now, just going back there, the question of brands. Brands obviously are a combination of reputation and proprietary knowledge in the sense of trademarks, copyright information, such like, and they need to be managed very carefully, and that's an important process, and the point that actually David raised there, the ability to track that information and make sure that it is not lost in the process of personnel changes and such like. It's very, very important, and that increases the strength of the company and makes the company or the business a saleable commodity, much more valuable than a company which has no clear view of its internal strengths and weaknesses. All right? The other thing that I think is very important that a lot of businesses don't pick up on is this in knowledge within the company of commercial and social relationships. The people who know the right people to ring up, the right people to call in, the right people to bring on side, you know, the white knights for a project, whatever. It's the people who have what I call Chinese contracts and little black books. They have a book full of names, valuable names. It's a list which in itself is copyright, if you like. But it's valuable because it's a list of appropriate people. I have 3,000 names on my database at any one time of people who I can call on who've got particular skills. That's an immensely valuable thing to me. More valuable to me than any of my computer hardware in itself, more valuable than almost anything else, is my ability to track people down all around the world and find them with a particular skill. I don't have to spend a week looking for them. I know where they are already, or at least someone who can find them. It's an immensely valuable resource, and if it's not captured, it will disappear. When that person leaves the company, as inevitably people do, I mean, no one actually stays forever. If they take that information with you, the company has lost, the business has lost a very important aspect. You know, databases of contacts and updating contacts is very, very important. And again, it's not hard to do anymore. Used to be difficult, it's not hard now. That's one of the reasons, clearly, that, you know, large amounts of money are paid to buy CEOs and pay them $1 million a year. It's as much because of who they know as what they know. They can bring on corporate credibility, they can bring in perception of ability, they can find the right people and attract them, and it's as much because of, as I say, who they know as much as what they know. The skill set is probably much the same amongst all of them. It's how good that little black book is. It's really, really important. I guess what I'm trying to come back to in all of this is that innovation is a human activity, and it's actually, I found a really nice quote here for you, which sums it up to me anyway. And it was from Peter Drucker, and he said, innovation is the core competence of the competitive modern enterprise. Now, I take it as read that we all want to be a competitive modern enterprise, that we don't want to be an uncompetitive yesterday enterprise, so bear with it. It must be established at the heart of the organisation, and that's the heart of the organisation, not simply peripheral or, in your spare time we do this. It's the heart of the organisation from the beginning, continuously nurtured by investment and executive support, and it must be systematically transferred into value for the firm. So it's not a case of, it's something optional, in my view. If we want to maintain competitive advantage or even our current position relative to our competitors, we have to be taking this really, really seriously and making allowance for it, not just in a case of, it's something we should do. It's something that the managing director, the board of directors, the budgeting people should all be allocating within that budget, IP management and review, because it's simply a logical part of the management. Hello, we have another call. Peter, good afternoon.
Hello, Colin, how are you?
Very well, how are things?
Enjoying the show.
Good.
We're in the midst of building ourselves a website, so I'm hoping I'm not jumping the gun here
No.
far as you're... How hard is it to protect your intellectual copyright on a website these days? As far as brand power, what we write in there in text,
Right.
logos, that sort of thing, because I know how easy it is to grab things off the internet and websites.
It is. I think my view with the internet is that you have to take as an adage that the cat is out of the bag to a large extent. There are encryption processes, and there are clearly proprietary aspects of copyright and trademarks which you can attach to the logos and to the content, but the reality is that you are not going to go over to Nigeria and find that guy who downloaded your site and is copying it. That's a given. I take the view, and I think the music industry and the film industry has taken the right view. They said, right, we will treat this as a sacrificial anode. We will put stuff on there in the hope that they will take it.
Right.
I had a conversation with someone recently. They said, I've got a record, but what if it gets copied in Asia? And I said, well, thank you, lucky stars. That means there's demand for you. You can run a concert program on the back of that if you've got enough demand. Don't complain about that. I mean, don't emphasise and don't encourage it, but accept that theft, in a sense, can be a marketing tool.
A marketing tool rather than legal infringement.
What you need to do is accept that it will be taken, encourage that it will be taken, and brand it. I've been working with a virtual band. Again, I think the music industry, if you like, is very well advanced at this. And we did a song which was for free download, but we made sure that it was tagged prior to that with a voiceover that said, hi, we are Juju Eyeballs, and welcome to our site. Come and see us at jujueyeballs.com. And then it rolled into the song. Now, I want everyone to download that. I don't care anymore that it's being downloaded.
So look at it as something that could be downloaded.
Yeah, I think and build it in the way to encourage that.
Okay.
I think if you try and be protective and say, look, I don't want this to be taken away from me, you actually lose the benefit of a website. A website is there like a free brochure. It's like an opportunity for them to knock on your door and get information.
Great.
If they download it, that's great. You can have layers of access. I mean, it's not quite possible to say, look, up to this point in the site is free, and simply, you can blow in, blow out. It's like we have the front door wide open. But if you want to go to the next level, you need to register. We trade information at that point. a
Okay.
name, an email account, a bit of information, what kind of car you drive. I mean, it's basic stuff, but it gives you some kind of measure of the people who are going to your site and gives you a valuable tool in itself. And you can trade and you develop a relationship with the people coming to your site. And eventually, that can turn into a genuine portal access for them to come to you.
All right, thanks, Colin. It's great.
All right?
Okay, thank you.
Pleasure.
Bye-bye.
All right. So it's a very important point. That's because there's websites are a very clear example, modern example of development of a whole range of individual aspects of a corporation. They can contain the proprietary aspects of trademarks, copyright, content. They contain ideas which may be quite important commercial ideas which you don't necessarily want everyone to know. So you have to accept that there is a certain amount you can say out up front and a certain amount you need to hold back and then qualify, as it were, people to come in to get that information. It doesn't have to be a wide open door right the way through to the kitchen. You can have it graded and have access points all the way through. I'm dealing with a large website which is about to be launched in a few months' time, and it will involve just that, where people will be, anyone can enter, it's free, but you'll qualify yourself when you go in. You'll get a password, you'll get an ID, and you'll get a small profile, and that profile will then track you right through the system. So eventually we'll have a profile on everyone who comes onto the site. And it's not harmful, it won't ID them in any other sense, but it means that we can then anticipate what people want and present it to them before them having to say, you guys really don't know what's going on, do you? Hopefully we'll say, well, not only do we know what's happening, but we've already done it. And here it is. And that to us is a competitive edge. All right? So I guess that's the area that I want to particularly come back to, is the importance of these aspects within the organisation, because to my view, any business organisation is simply a vehicle. It's a way of delivering ideas and commercialising them. So it's always coming back to people, and the business is simply a means of, it's like a rowboat. You've got rowers, but they have to have something to row, and it provides a structure for them. All right? Now, what I'll do, we're coming up towards the first break, but just before we get to that, what I want to do is quickly deal with this area of intellectual property and the creative process, especially when you're dealing with third parties. Now, obviously, businesses are creating, they have their own employees, they have people generating stuff, but more and more we're seeing work being outsourced, such as the question before about websites. Now, I would assume that the website is being developed by a third-party web company. Straight away, that raises really interesting issues about who owns the graphic, who owns the content, who controls the mailing lists and the name lists of the people who hit that list. All of those issues are very important, and they will be affected very directly by whether it is done in-house or outsourced. Now, I use outsourced in the broader sense of by independent contractors, be they part-time, full-time, whatever. And I'm dividing the world into employees and rest of world. So when I say outsourced, that's really anything that isn't done by an employee, who, again, can be part-time or they can be full-time. And it's a very important distinction, because the way that the legislation that covers proprietary rights is written, as a premise, and there are exceptions, but as a basic rule, the owner of the work that's created is not actually the party who necessarily pays for it, but is in fact the person who creates it. And then there has to be a relationship struck up. So it's quite important, well, no, it's more than quite, it's extremely important that you analyse the relationship with these people prior to you embarking on a creative process, because you can in fact end up with the unfortunate situation where you think you own something, in fact you don't. Now, an example of that I have is a client of mine who was one of the country's best wine label designers, packaging designers. He designed wine labels like Queen Adelaide, most of the great wine labels of the 60s and 70s were his. He owns the copyright in all of them still. Now, that would come as a terrible shock to most of the companies that are distributing, but they in fact don't own the copyright. Now, that has a very important implication. A, they can't book the copyright as a valuer in their books because they don't own it. B, if there was a copyright infringement, they can't sue because they don't own the copyright, he does. And C, up until recently, there were parallel importation provisions which prevented importation of copyright labels. That's been removed now. But it's a very important aspect of them not owning the most important element of the marketing of their product, which is the label. I think most people would accept now that something like 60% of the marketing effort on a wine is on the label, and yet he owns the copyright. We have another caller. Mary, good afternoon.
Hi, Colin. I've just got a general copyright question.
Yeah?
If I'm working for someone and I write, whether it's music or something written, who owns the copyright?
Well, are you an employee in the technical, strict sense of paying superannuation and all the rest of it? Yeah. In that case, your employer would normally own that, even if you write that outside of normal working hours.
Great.
Now, but what you can do, I mean, I don't think you meant great, don't you?
It answers
I think what
yes.
you meant was, great. That is subject to the proviso that you can modify that relationship at any time as part of your agreement and simply say, look, some kinds of work my employer and you should own because of that. Other work I should own because it's nothing to do, you don't need to know. And sometimes you don't have to have ownership. It's not necessarily ownership being the critical issue. Control can be another issue as well. Okay. But as a premise, yes, your employer, and that's true of whether computer programs, graphics, virtually any output, the employer will, as a general rule, own it. And as I say, because of the nature of the employment contract being a 24-hour contract, it would apply even to work that you do outside of, if it's related to your work activities.
Okay, what if I was a subcontractor who was employed to write that particular piece of music or computer program?
Well, again, if they are an independent contractor brought in simply on a spec, then they would own it, unless there's an agreement to the contrary.
Okay.
All right. I can see some thinking. All right, well, we have to go to the break now, so a couple of minutes, recharge your cups of tea, and we'll be back in over 2 minutes. Welcome back. Continuing on from intellectual property, of course there's a telephone number which you can ring, 1-800 number, and thank you for the call so far, really appreciate it. I'll just go back now, and I think to recap on what we were just talking about before the break. If we nip to the slide, you'll see I've summarised a couple of key points for you in relation to this whole area of relationships between organisations and the people who are actually creating. Now, it's really important you remember, just because you pay someone to perform a task doesn't mean the underlying IP rights are or will be assigned to you. Case in point, if you get a brochure produced for you by an external art house or a website produced, whatever, primarily and prima facie, that information and all that, the underlying proprietary rights will belong to the person who created them, not to you, even though you've paid them for it. You have to make rights clear and part of the documentation when you do the assignment and the confirmation of the job. Now, some advertising agencies are being a little bit tricky in that, and they're putting a purported assignment of copyright at the bottom of their invoices. I would strike that out immediately if I were you, and I think it's quite pushing it, frankly. But it's an indication that they take it seriously, and I think everyone who does work and orders work from third parties needs to consider the ownership issues, not least because if you get to the point that you're thinking about, say, franchising your business, it's a nasty shock to find that, in fact, the copyright in the manuals and the logos and all the information you've been using, in fact, rests in some third party who you don't even know where they are anymore because they've gone out of business or they've ceased to exist. It's a great worry, and it means that your due diligence will be extremely problematic and, in fact, could harpoon the whole exercise. So this outsourced task, which is increasingly and certainly important that it continue. I mean, it's the only way that companies can acquire the skills they need without becoming megalithic organisations. It means that you have to be very careful in your job specification and you're defining where the rights will be. It's not particularly difficult in terms of phraseology. I mean, basically all it needs to be is words to the effect of that the intellectual property created in the course of the particular job is assigned prospectively to us, whoever we are, as a term of the remuneration. Now, sometimes people have to go back and patch things up. You have an industrial design or, say, a logo or some graphic work done outside, and afterwards you think, oh, I really need to get the copyright. There's no, I mean, as a rule of thumb, and it's no more than a rule of thumb in my thumb, I'd say it's the cost of the original commission by, again, so effectively 200% of the commission to get the underlying copyrights. But that's by no means a rule that is written in stone. It's something which people can use as a guideline. Ideally, it should be documented prior to the activity occurring. Otherwise, you have the potential for getting into an argument, which is undesirable. Okay, issue, again, ownership and control, which is what we're really getting back to. Ownership does not equal control, but it does give you a very clear place within the environment to exercise at least an important function over control. Now, if you own, say, a copyright work and you license it to someone, should the license be infringed, you can simply pull the license and the ownership reverts back to you. But if you've sold the copyright, for example, the fact that they have stopped paying you the royalties doesn't of itself automatically mean that you get the copyrights back, any more than because you sell a house that someone, and then someone doesn't pay the full money, that you get your house back. If the contract provides for an automatic reassignment, then you're fine. But if it doesn't, the chances are that you in fact have a contractual right and an opportunity to get your money back, but you don't get the copyrights back automatically. So that's why I love licensing rather than sale wherever possible, because it gives the vendor some degree of comfort. You can have an automatic assignment at the end of the completion of whatever the terms are, but that's a different proposition. Control is really, really important, and contractual obligations often aren't quite enough to give you immediate control that you need to prevent activities from happening. Now, I've just got here another note here I said about the Copyright Act, just to remind you that the owner of the work is the author and not necessarily the person who paid for it. Now, there are exceptions within that area, within that rule, in relation particularly to things like portraits, photographs, newspaper articles. There's a whole number of technical exceptions, but it's probably safest to use this as your base point and say, right, let's assume that they're not an employee, therefore let's assume that this third party will own it. Let's make sure we deal with it in our contracts. Simple as that. Now, if we're talking lawyer territory, not a lot, but once you've got the right phraseology and you've got the right documentation, you don't have to do it again. But it's very important. Then at least you have the starting point and the opportunity to manage your IP as it's developed. The same thing applies, say, for trademarks, patents, designs, and basically any areas of proprietary IP. The ownership issue vests primarily with the creator and not with the party who paid for it. There are, as I say, with exceptions. That, again, and I have to just underline this again, is this need to ascertain the precise relationship between your enterprise and the third party. And it's not always crystal clear. Sometimes people have been in a job for many years. They appear to be employees in every sense, except that they've never been actually taken on full-time. They may in fact be part-time. They may be employed by an agency. And computer programmers were a case in point many years ago, where computer programmers were in the same job for many years, but in fact were employed by their own service company and owned all the copyright in the work that they produced. Most contracts now contain an assignment of copyright. They didn't for a while, and there was some very nasty events happened over that. The need to document the relationship. Paperwork, paperwork, paperwork. An assignment of copyright, in order to be valid, has to be in writing, signed by the creator, simply on the owner. You can't get around it. If it ain't documented and if it isn't signed by the owner, it isn't going to work. So it's got to be paper and pencil, and it's got to be linked, ideally, to delivery, so that at some point there is a clear understanding of when the assignment took place. It's basic contract law, if you like, but it's an area that you need to talk to your advisors about to get detailed for your particular environment, but that's where you've got to operate. So that's really the environment we're working in, that creation of these IP elements arise all around the activity. Some are within internal, some are external. The issue then, I suppose, is, well, how do we keep track of all of these things? How do we keep track of the thousands of images, of pages, of the information we have? The odd thing is that most companies, most businesses have these systems, albeit informally, but they often have these systems in place if they were then taken the next step of being organised and properly integrated into the management system so that they were maintained and that there was actually a library function. Now, in the US, a number of large companies have adopted full-time librarians, not in the sense of looking after a room full of books, but they are the librarians for the knowledge base of the company. And they collect information from outside and disseminate it internally. They are given the task of documenting and structuring their information. As I say, going back to that information, the situation with the Antarctic Division, they have 50 years worth of unbelievable records. Now, had it simply been left in cardboard boxes, they would have no idea what it was, and it wouldn't be valuable, because at the moment, anyone can ring the Antarctic Division and say, I want a photograph of a seal eating a tractor. And they've probably got one, and they've probably got a database that says seal and tractor eating, and they can find it within seconds. If you wrote in the request and asked for it, and three weeks later they say, we've got some pictures in a box, we get back to you one day, you'd just say, don't bother. You know, there's value in the ability to process the request quickly, and that's where systems are vital. The obvious first starting point for most businesses is their paper-based records. It's the accumulation of diaries of the individuals, both corporate diaries in the sense of where they're going to be, who they've met, diaries and phone numbers, the rest of it, files and memo trails within the documents themselves, documenting a transaction, and that's very, very important. And you've got that area of forms and processes, which I'm using in the sense that you can develop internally simple paper-based forms which will help you track the IP within a product. Now, I think last session I showed you a simple form that showed basically the name of the name of the creator, their relationship, who it was, when it was created, the edition. That can be done on paper quite simply and affixed to each edition or each volume as it's brought in a process of creation, so that each development stage is logged. Paper in these things is becoming more cumbersome or less desirable than computer-based, but it's by no means redundant. It's a useful thing because it's always there. I'm a great believer in paper-based systems myself. I really do believe they're important. Electronic-based is clearly the area where we're going now, and that is the whole area of emails. I'll just show you emails, internet exchanges, intranets, project management forms and processes, again, which are in specially created documents enabling you to track. Now, there's some wonderful software for those sort of processes which provide management tools, timelines, information flows, all the rest of it, and they are off the shelf. Claris produces, I forget the name of the software, but there's any number of different software packages which come already made, able to provide that information. And I cannot emphasize the need to select not the jet-propelled, all bells and whistles version at the expense of it actually being usable. You acquire the system and apply the system which is appropriate to the least skilled person in the organisation, because they are the one who's going to decide whether it goes. As any convoy is as fast as the slowest ship, a system is only as good as the least efficient user of it. And if people are not putting information in, not only do you miss capturing that information, it in fact skews the results of when you go to use the information, because you assume that it's 100% and it's not. And there can be gaping holes in it, and that is actually more dangerous than having wrong information, believe it or not. So I'm really very, very, very keen on the idea that you choose simple, usable systems and then upgrade over a period of time, except that there's a ramping up period of maybe 2 years, 3 years, whatever, where people get used to the idea, become accustomed to filling in forms, going out there. I mean, I've had the experience myself of buying a new diary program. It's the new current version of the program I've been using for years. I hate it because it's too complicated. It's doing all kinds of things I don't want to know about, and I have to try and learn. I like the old system. It works. All right? You've got a whole area of mentors and work groups who create a lot of information as well. That's part of your information systems as well. Being able to manage and document these things. They're simply a part of the way the business operates, and they should be documented and kept track of, so that the output of those mentoring groups can be converted back into usable in IP for the organisation. I think the question with all these things is the audit process how you actually go about auditing is a very important issue. That's the area that I'll be dealing with in the final session of this session, but is almost a subject in itself, auditing. But except that what you're trying to do is take an organism, as it were, corporate organism, and take a picture of it in a way that is an objective measure of the various parameters within it. And that means that you could go on forever, or you could say, no, let's define our audit to fairly precise terms and try and get that as accurate as possible, and then move on to the next and on to the next. Again, there's a danger of trying to do too much and actually never having a proper useful outcome. Very, very useful to stop and think and say, when do we have to have this finished? Can we achieve this now? Now, one of the tools that I use for these things is to say, let's just set ourselves a timeline. Where do we want to be in, say, 12 months' time? And we say, well, okay, where we want to be is this. You don't worry too much about reality in a sense. You just say, right, what do we want to have achieved and when do we think we need it? 12 months, okay. And you set that out, parameters there. And you say, okay, where do we have to be in 6 months' time? And then you fill that again. Then you say, where do I have to be within 3 months' time? And then where do I have to be within 6 weeks' time? By that process, you've created effectively a battle plan for doing the activity. And I've used that for a lot of different activities, I might add. It's an extremely useful tool. It's simple, and it means even people who are not very keen on planning get quite excited because it's a chance to exercise their imagination, and then you automatically develop the stages you need to go through to get back to that system. It's very simple, but it works really, really well. Now, I think we're just about up to the next break here, so I'll cut off now for 2 minutes. We'll be back in 2 and for the big wrap-up. See you then. Welcome back. Intellectual property management and related subjects. Right, into the world of IP audits. Wonderful things. I've been involved in a number of large-scale activities, actions over the years for developing databases and IP audits in effect. One of the worst being something like 700,000 pieces of data having to be linked to about 2,000 contracts. It was a major job. It highlighted to me one of the major issues within any audit and any process is that data capture is the most difficult aspect of anything. Once you've made the decision that you want to go through IP audit, and it's a very broad term which covers a lot of different aspects, as I'll explain, defining the data to be collected is a key issue because that will quarantine your costs, because otherwise you can be in an infinite scale of expenditure trying to find the unfindable. It's a disaster if you go on and have an undefined objective. Capturing 100% accurate data is very important. That's clearly your objective. There will always be an error ratio within data collections, but by careful design of the forms themselves and careful design of the parameters, you can get a very much more accurate result than might otherwise be the case. At all times, testing and verifying the audit process is very important. You need to obviously decide in an audit whether it's going to be a full audit of every item or whether it's going to be a random audit. For IP, I'm not sure that a random audit is appropriate except as a test vehicle, the first object, to find whether in fact you need to do that process. IP audits, in my view, are not things you can do quickly or take shortcuts, because they're an important part of a self-appraisal of a business, an organisation. So they shouldn't be treated as being an imposition. They're a valuable way for the organisation to learn. It's the corporate equivalent of psychoanalysis, I suppose. The other thing, of course, is that the actual processes for IP management in the broad sense of day-to-day is more and more a case of software, appropriate software. I, again, go for simple software which can be upscaled. I don't really think it's worth having extremely complex forms which no one uses. Doesn't get you anywhere. The other issue when you're getting towards IP management, both in terms of a historical development or picture of your organisation or a prospective development, is when do we start? What's our starting point? By that I mean, if you have a company which has got a 20-year history of business development and business activity, you can choose to develop an IP audit, an IP trail from day one, from 10 years, 5 years, yesterday, as of tomorrow. That is a commercial question. Clearly, as of now, if you do it as of now and say, right, everything from now is going to be properly documented and structured, then the cost is comparatively low because it's adding to people's existing work. If you're going back historically and developing perhaps data mining, as it were, then that is something which can take a fairly high drain of resources if not properly or carefully managed. You need to decide whether it's going to be collected on a project basis, on a temporal, as in time-based basis, or perhaps maybe just on a purpose basis. Now, litigation is one of the great IP audit motivators. You find that when, say, there's litigation in relation to a particular film, but I mean virtually any intellectual property-based activity, the first thing that your solicitors will ask for you is for affidavits going back to the way that your work came into existence and all the rest of it. Now, if you have that documented in some form in business records, you've got 80% of your work done already. If you have to go back and rebuild that information, historical information, from nothing, you can be a long time, and it increase the cost of your litigation enormously. And in fact, I have seen the situation where a simple answer to a claim brought the litigation to a halt because it was answerable. Immediately, it was clear that this was not going to be an easy defendant. It was going to be a defendant who had answers to everything, and just stopped the case. It's worth thinking about. Software generally for use in IP management and tracking, I really believe off-the-shelf products are invaluable, and for that point of view, I have a particular weakness for FileMaker, I suppose, but there are Lotus Notes, there's Excel, ISIS does some fantastic work. There are, as well, some very interesting large-scale data management systems being developed which are available for license. If you find someone who's got a system that they're doing, why not make an offer to license it from them or to acquire a site license? For many companies, the fact that they've spent maybe $500,000 making an extremely detailed database management system, nothing would thrill them more than the thought that someone would make them an offer, particularly if it's not a competing industry, I hasten to add. From their point of view, there's no downside. They can make some money back out of their investment. And from your point of view, you can get a fully tested, fully operational system with possibly some support. So it's worth considering that option as well. As I say, there are issues about competition where parties within the same competing industry may find it difficult to get access to that unless it's proprietary, but that's something you need to look at. Audits and IP management, generally, you have to be prepared to, you may have to add additional staff because, frankly, not everyone has enough time. We've downsized our organisations to the point now that not too many people have time to sit and make that fourth cup of tea while they sharpen the pencils and decide what tomorrow will bring. Most people, organisations have skinned down to the point that they don't have a lot of spare time, and IP management as a full-time organisation, I think, justifies serious consideration of bringing people in. Not necessarily having to be employees, they can be outside, but you've got to bring them in. So that's a broad sense. I wish I was able to spend, say, more time on the audit process itself, because it's a very interesting area in itself. But I think for the purposes of today, understanding that the audit process is not unlike a financial audit, except that it requires asking just the right questions and tracking through the information historically on your corporation. And it's remarkable how much information can be gleaned without having to turn the company completely inside out. I thought finally, just quickly touch on the area of valuation, because clearly that's an important aspect for any business. I mean, if you're going to go into IP auditing, then clearly the valuation is the next logical stage. There are basically four areas which affect the valuation process. You've got accounting standards, which are in national and international. You've got stock exchange rules, which have certain requirements about how information is to be presented. You've got a consideration of what is the nature of the intended use of the valuation, and you've also got the management priority, if you like, that the the management decisions need to be based on current information. So it's the selection of the valuation process and the valuation tools, to an extent, are set by external requirements. There are various methods of valuation. I'd also recommend at this stage, there's a very good website which is a UK site. It's a company called DJ Neil and Limited, and they have some fascinating stuff to withdraw. It's fairly technical. In fact, some of it is quite frighteningly mathematically based, but it's really interesting stuff. If you've got an interest in it, particularly an accounting aspect, I thoroughly recommend a view. They've got a fair bit of stuff that you can either download or get sent out to you. Extremely capable, interesting people, and they seem to be quite happy to have a dialogue as well. I've had some quite interesting email chats with them over the years. The other thing is that the valuation process has got to obviously comply with the legal requirements. Otherwise it's of no use. The process of valuation requires independence and it requires objectivity. And from that point of view, it's not appropriate, for example, to have your valuer put onto a percentage of the value of the goods or the thing that's being valued, for example. That would create, in my view, an unacceptable conflict of interest and would be inexplicable if the valuation was subject to review. The general mathematical or accounting processes applied are, some of them are more appropriate than others, in my view. I mean, they are an evolution of 500 years of double entry bookkeeping, so we have to accept that they are here. But I think some forms of value are more appropriate to others when we're talking about IP in the broad sense of intangible assets. The net present value system is in many ways the most widely applauded, I suppose, where you're basically taking the cash flows of the project over its life and turning it into current dollars. Now that's notoriously difficult to do with things such as artistic, if you like, IP, where you've got ongoing sales and such like. But I suppose it's more useful for a business or an activity, integrated activity. You've got replacement value, which is a really interesting area. That assumes, of course, that replacement is actually feasible and that there's an alternative, which may not, in fact, be the case in relation to many proprietary knowledge issues. There may not be a replacement available because the one you have is the one you have. I mean, there is only one Elton John, for example. I don't see how Universal could revalue the Elton John catalogue on the basis of a replacement Elton John. Strikes me as being an absurdity, but clearly it would be appropriate to say software which could be rewritten or written again. The market value is an interesting area. That again assumes a willing vendor and a willing buyer. What I find curious there is, of course, that the vendor is going to value it on one basis and the buyer will value it on another, and both of those are highly subjective valuations. So in fact we end up with an average of two subjective valuations. Does that not end up with another objective valuation? Who knows? Depreciated value is, again, quite widely used. I have a little trouble with that only because of the magic pudding effect of licensing of IP. Much of the IP that I deal with, particularly, acquires its value by being licensed and reused and reused and reused. It's not really appropriate to depreciate it because it's in fact appreciating through time. So, from my point of view, I choose not to like that one very much. But I can see it has value for things such as software, that kind of thing. Terrific. Again, it's a certain amount of art required in this. We have the going concern value. Again, great for organisations and even for creative activities, creative groups. You can say, well, we have a design house, we have a going concern value, we have a certain amount of assets, attributes, whatever. We can value that, and that's a fairly straightforward accounting process. Discounted cash flow analysis. I don't know. Now we're getting to accountant territory, and I don't frankly want to go there. Thank you very much. Opportunity cost is more like a business tool. It's a way of assessing whether or not you should go into something and whether you can afford not to. Now, I have a number of instances where we've had to make decisions about activity which was based more on not so much the cost, but what the cost was if we didn't do it. And that's a fairly major question, and that's not really evaluation in the ordinary sense. that's just about towards the end of this session. I guess the valuation issue is important that you remember that it's a summation of objective facts interpreted with a fairly high degree of subjectivity. So in fact, I guess valuation, notwithstanding that we are trying to reach an objective figure, is by its nature uncertain. There is no font of knowledge. There's not ground on a piece of granite somewhere that the value of this IP is this many dollars. And in fact, the valuation may not be dollars. It may appropriately be in terms of its ability to generate income. It could be graded 1 to 10. There are various ways. All right. Now, I don't know if there are any more questions there. Just please remember, the phone number now, of course, is not going to work, but there is an email address, and that is info@knowledge.net.au. Attention to me, Colin Seeger, and I'll be happy to try and deal with some of the issues. I'm trying not to make them voluminous if you can, but if they require can deal with a short answer or a quick direction onto somewhere, terrific. Very quickly, 2 excellent books which I would recommend to people who are perhaps wanting to get into this area and perhaps haven't quite done it. One is this one called Intellectual Capital by a guy called Leif Erikson, Edvardsen, who is with Scandia, and it's a fairly chatty, rollicking tale of intellectual capital in the 20th century, and it's very good text, readily available. The other one which I find is very good, and this is one of the first texts that I came across in this area, actually, is Intellectual Capital by Annie Brooking. Again, UK company, organisation, full of very interesting charts and simple diagrams and methodologies. There are a lot of books now on the area. You go into management text sections of any of the major bookshops and you could die under the weight of the books there. But again, if you can't actually understand them, they're no use to you. You've got to build up to it because the concepts are things that take a little time to get used to. All right? Again, thank you for your time for the session. I've enjoyed presenting. I hope you've enjoyed the information. As I say, don't hesitate to contact me by email if you want some follow-up on some of the points there. And of course, I hope you will now go out and apply this assiduously and become rich and famous along with the rest of Silicon Valley and 3M and all those other companies that have applied this over the years and done very well. Thank you for your time. Talk to you again. Bye.